Hey!
Hey.
Sorry, I'm running a little bit behind. It's always seems to happen that whenever we're doing a live or doing something like this, that like technical difficulties happen. So sorry
Yeah,
about that.
no, it's
How are
totally
you?
fine. I'm good. You look so gorgeous. I'm
Thank
glad to
you.
get into this. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. I was reading your article and I was like, this is so interesting. I want to talk more about this. I'm glad that you were able to hop on.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are just now joining or don't know what's going on, today we're chatting with Elizabeth Cline, and she's going to be talking to us about the myth of conscious consumerism. So for those who are just joining or those who may not know who you are, can you tell us a bit about who Elizabeth Cline is and what you do in this space?
I'm a journalist and an author. I've written two books. The first was called Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion. And in 2019, I wrote a book called The Conscious Closet, The Revolutionary Guide to Looking Good While Doing Good. So I guess I'm an expert in consumer culture, fast fashion, and the labor and environmental impacts of the clothing industry. And I guess until recently, a very committed ethical consumer, which is what we're here to talk about.
Well, I guess maybe just to start off, can you talk about what an ethical consumer actually is and what ethical consumerism is? I know there's no like actual definition, but just sort of what we believe it to be or what you believe it to be.
Basically, I wanted to look at the ideological framework of ethical consumerism. Like, what is it that we really think, like unpack what it is we think we're doing when we shop with our values.
Mm,
And like you were saying, what I've heard from people is that they felt the same way, like they were circling around
hmm
some sort of problem with the way we understand it, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was, like what
hmm
was not right about the way we frame our consumption choices. And I have been feeling that way, to be honest, for years. Like, I remember even after Overdress came out, people being like, where do I shop? Where do I shop? That would be their first question after I explained this incredibly complicated problem of fast fashion. That was always the first thing they wanted to know. But really, what I'm arguing in that Atmos story is that ethical consumers are part of a neoliberal political tradition. We view the market, I'm just going to go high level and then we can like pick it apart,
Yeah,
that
totally.
we believe the marketplace is self-correcting. So we are
hmm
sending the market cues that we want ethical and sustainable products, and the market will become more just and more sustainable over time just by virtue of the way that we shop. And so once I started to think of it that way, I started to think about the other implications of thinking of consumption that way and why it gets us into trouble. So I think that ethical consumers, and this is the argument I'm making in the piece, this is the way
hmm
I am conceiving of the ideology. The first is, as I just said, we believe that the market is self-correcting. By telling stores or brands that you want ethical and sustainable things, then brands become more responsible to society over time. We also view purchasing practices as moral decisions, hence the name ethical consumerism. So what that means is that you can be a bad person based on where you shop. I mean, I think a lot of us saw that on Black Friday, like the
hmm
annual like scolding of people for buying
hmm
fast fashion. I have certainly done that to people. So there's a moral attitude attached to it. But the main thing about ethical consumerism is it has over time, I don't think it started out this way, but over time, it has privatized our idea of social change. Like, we are only trying to change society through the market, and very few of us participate in public social change, which would be social change that is available to everyone. So changing our elected leaders, changing policy, changing laws, or just going to a company like Fashion Nova or H&M and saying, we want you to change your policies so that change is available to everybody. So one of the things about what I'm seeing in the space, and this is one of the reasons why I had my own change of heart, is I think that we overestimate the power we have over the market as consumers. And I will give Amazon as an example. Amazon has hired, they are unequivocally the winners of the pandemic. They have hired 500,000 people since March.
Wow.
Like,
wow.
There's
wow.
no, if we as a community want to stop Amazon, we have to organize against Amazon. One of the things that is missing is a clear strategy, tactics, goals. Like a lot of what we're doing in ethical and sustainable fashion is awareness raising and education, but the only goal is for people to shift where they're shopping. Like there's not a wider plan. So that would be honestly what I think was missing in the Black Friday conversation is like, what are we going to do about this? These companies are gaining power every year. Like, I hate to say it, but a lot of the fast fashion players, a lot of companies are going out of business during the pandemic. But the fast fashion players are just taking their market share. So what is a community, our solution to that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never really thought about that. Yeah, definitely a lot of what we're doing is awareness building, but you're right. Like, what is the what's next? You know what I mean? Like, we're definitely doing a great job of like, you know, educating people. Yeah, but then like, what do we do after they've been educated? Yeah, that's making me think over here. So my next question is, so in the article you talk about how you are no longer an ethical consumer. So I guess maybe I was curious if you can tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, I suppose you sort of explained like how you come to that realization, but like, what does that mean?
When I read The Conscious Closet, what I see is me wrestling with myself, because the first part of the book is about curating like a sustainable wardrobe. And then the last section is about collective action. And it's very telling that I don't think anyone in any interview has ever asked me about that section of the book. So one of the issues is that when we have this conversation about change, we talk about it as individual versus collective action. And that's the framework that the Conscious Closet is written around. But that framework made me feel stuck. Like it's still, I still was like, these are not the two choices. This isn't quite right. So what made everything click for me was ordering this book from the 1970s in January. I have it here. I put it on my Instagram story. So it's an anthology edited by Ralph Nader, and it is about the consumer activist movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And every chapter is about a different industry. Like there were activists that were working on the tobacco industry, the food industry, the auto industry. And I kind of started to see how they looked at the world compared to how we look at the world. And that's when I was like, okay, I know what we've done. We've privatized social change, essentially. And we think that change should happen through the marketplace by forcing, through the way that we shop, we are going to change companies to make them better. Whereas consumer activists in the past, one, if a company did something wrong, so Amazon or H&M or Fashion Nova, whoever it is, it's not our fault for the way that we shop. It is that company's fault. So companies have a responsibility to society. We did not make that company do something bad. So that's one like huge difference between the way we think today versus how people used to think. The other thing, and this is, I think, huge, is that consumer activists of the 60s and 70s, and I'm including civil rights activists in this, of the progressive era, they knew that capitalism would always pull in a certain direction, which is towards extreme market concentration, so towards monopoly power, it would always pull towards low wages, environmental exploitation, and it would divide workers based on race, class, gender, and everything else. So in order to counteract that, you can't use the market to do that. You have to use the government to do that, and people power and labor unions. So I don't think individual versus collective action is the framework. It's private social change, which is what ethical consumption is, versus public social change, which is through the government, civil society, mass movements, policy, law, grassroots campaigns for change, and labor unions. I didn't mention that. So that for me was like, I was finally like, oh my God, this is where we've been going wrong.
Gosh, I have so many other questions, but I'll stick to what we talked about. But like, yeah, oh my gosh, it's so much. And when you break it down like that, it totally makes so much sense. Okay, so in the article, I'm gonna pull up my notes here. So in the article, you said ethical consumerism is a grossly inadequate and unequal response to our most pressing problems like climate change, systematic racism, sweatshop wages, and growing inequalities, and more so. More so, I'm convinced that these problems are at large part created by unchecked corporate power, unregulated capitalism, and our weakened democracy that ethical consumers help prop up. So you kind of talked about that, but can you just sort of dig a little deeper into that, into what you like meant with that passage?
Yeah, so again, I encourage people to read this story because that comes towards the end of the piece, and like, I don't just come out of the gate being like, ethical consumers are the problem, you know, like, but I do think that in a way, a lot of us have become part of the problem, and I will provide some examples, like Amazon, right? Like our response to Amazon is to not shop at Amazon. Our response to Facebook, you know, like the documentary that everybody watched about Facebook, is to get off Facebook or delete your Instagram account. And even the two examples I give in the piece are, I remember when Everlane, they had workers that were trying to unionize, and I looked at the comments, and people were saying, oh, well, I don't shop there anyway. The implication is that you've done your job as a citizen because you made a private choice in the marketplace that's not available to everyone, that you've ticked the box of doing something. And we also know that Americans in particular, and particularly like well-off, like privileged Americans, are not politically active at all. Like we vote every 4 years and that's it. So I think that ethical consumerism has become a way for us to feel like we're politically engaged, but really it is a private consumer choice. That's what it is. We're creating a market for ethical and sustainable goods, but we're not actually solving the problem underneath. I think that every time we buy an ethical and sustainable product, it should be a reminder of how much work we have to do. The fact that these products have to exist and these companies have to exist should trouble us like deeply. Yeah.
It is interesting too, you know, when you think about that and thinking about what you just said, you know, sustainability has definitely become more popular right now, where it's like, everyone's sort of thinking about it now, but you know, folks have been fighting for this for quite some time. And if you sort of think about where it started versus like where it is now, there's not like a whole lot of change that has happened. I mean, correct me if you're wrong. If I'm wrong, it doesn't seem like there's like a whole lot that has truly changed. And I think Aisha from Remake, she was on a panel that SFF did, and she said, you know, sort of like, enough talking about this, you know, like we've been talking about this for years. We know that folks, you know, are not being paid, you know, fairly. We know that people are not making a living wage. Like we can talk, you know, until we're blue in the face about what needs to be done, but like actually what needs to happen now is like, we need to actually make change. Like we need to actually do something, like enough talking. And I thought that was really powerful when she said that. And it really made me think. And I think that what you're arguing, what you're talking about sort of, you know, falls in line with that of like, you know, from a different standpoint of like our purchasing, you know, and it is a little disheartening. I saw someone in the comments, you know, that said it's a little disheartening to think about it from that standpoint, because it's like how do you make change? And we'll talk about
Yeah.
that in a bit, but yeah, it's challenging. I guess then that leads me to asking though, is there such thing as ethical consumerism under capitalism? Like I think that has come up a lot in my mind and in conversations that I've seen. Or is there such thing as that?
So I sort of touch on that in the story, and I think that's I wonder what the origins of that phrase are, because I think what people mean when they say that, and please in the comments tell me if you think that I'm wrong, is that our only choices are ethical consumption or a revolution to overthrow capitalism. And my story is arguing that, in fact, we have a range of other options besides that, like actually participating in our democracy, for starters. You know what I mean? Like people go straight to, well, we're going to have a revolution to solve this problem. And most people on the left have never even organized, who identify as progressives, are not politically active. So one, I don't want to follow them in any sort of revolution because I don't think they have a plan. And two, I think that you know, I'm just being like kind of a wise ass, but like there are so many things that we could be doing. There are so many policies that we could be suggesting, changes to laws. We could just be going to consumer companies and asking for changes. You know, two really awesome consumer activist campaigns that have happened since the pandemic started is like the 15% pledge. So going to big companies and saying, we require you to stock your shelves with 15% Black-owned businesses. Like that is a strategy with a specific goal, and it is organized. So that is a perfect template of how change gets made. And then the pull up or shut up movement was similar, where it went to beauty companies and it said, we demand you to tell us, I think it was the executive board, like how many Black people and people of color are working for your company. And then it allows consumers to hold them, or citizens to hold these companies accountable. So and then of course I Pay Up is very much influenced by the consumer activist tradition. And after, you know, we got the money back from the brands in the middle of the summer, we sat down and we were like, well, how are we going to fix this? Because the fact that companies stole $40 billion is just evidence of the problem, right? You can't stop there. You have to then sit down and come up with a platform for change, which is what we did with Pay Up Fashion.
Yeah, those are some really great campaigns you mentioned. And yeah, I follow all of them and very excited to see like all the change that's happening because of them. So I wanted to share another piece from your article and ask you a bit about it. So you say consumption is an economic imperative. There is no escaping it under capitalism, and it is fundamentally determined by our income. Unless we believe that rich people who can afford more ethical products are somehow more ethical than the rest of us, we must confront that it is unacceptable and arguably deeply unethical in and of itself to ever tie human goodness to the way we buy. In fact, I now believe that the only ethical approach to consumption, if such a thing exists, is to make the cheapest available products as responsibly as possible. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so that section I think was the last thing I put in the story. And it was really influenced by this Guardian article that I can link to in my stories. And that Guardian article was about ethical consumerism, and it was written by a moral philosopher. But I mean, part of what it's saying is what we already debate in our community is like, when does ethical consumerism start to tip into classism? Like if you're expecting people to shop a certain way, it quickly becomes unfair because, you know, the first thing we have to consider when we buy something is price. But beyond that, this goes back to something we've already said, which is that a a lot of times what we do as ethical consumers is we'll say, I did not support Amazon, therefore I'm a good person. But I would actually argue that if you are not participating as a citizen in the problem of Amazon, solving the problem of Amazon, you are not, you're complicit in it. You know what I mean? Like this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how did we get to this place where we feel good about supporting ethical and sustainable fashion when it should be a reminder that unethical and unsustainable fashion still exists. And the example I give in the story is when I posted something about the Pay Up campaign, and I have to just remind people sometimes, like, this was not an abstract campaign. Like, there was $40 billion missing from these factories, and without this money, factories were letting people go without pay. So it was modern slavery, it was wage theft, it had very tangible consequences. And someone in my Twitter feed said, this is why I support small businesses. And I'm like, that choice has nothing to do with the fact that these people have been robbed. Those two things are not connected. You have not done your job as a citizen in solving this problem just because you supported a small company.
Because it's still happening, because fast fashion and these companies are still existing. People are still shopping them. So
yeah, I can clarify that. So it goes back to what I think the kind of ideological flaw of ethical consumerism is that we view the market as self-correcting. So when we are supporting ethical and sustainable brands, we think we're solving the underlying problem. We are not. And I really saw that up close working on Pay Up, because I saw the contracts that factories sign with brands, the purchase orders. Like, you see behind the scenes that even brands that H&M and Zara that position themselves as ethical, I mean, fundamentally they're trying to lower costs, gain market share, please their shareholders. Like, these are financial institutions that like function in a very particular way, and they are only going to respond to us and our demands in a very limited way. So we're not like solving those like underlying problems.
Gotcha. So kind of going back to the question that I had asked before when I was jumping the gun a bit. So if you're not an ethical consumer, then what guides your purchasing decisions now? And then you kind of like touched on that, but
I want to talk about that, because I'm not saying that people shouldn't support ethical and sustainable companies. Like I'm talking about using it as a tool for social change. Like, of course it matters to ethical and sustainable brands when we support them. Like, since I wrote the story, to be honest, I was doing a mix of both before, like supporting mainstream stores and ethical and sustainable brands. And now I still do both, but now I can be honest about it, because I no longer think that I'm a bad person just because I walked into a Target. I think, though, that we continue to overestimate the power that we have in the marketplace. I actually think our power as consumers to change companies, especially big companies, is pretty limited. And I think that we have 30 years of ethical consumerism as a case study. But our power as citizens, and I think I just saw Aisha in the comments saying this, it's huge. It is huge. Like, we need to remember that our government, our democracy, and our laws exist almost explicitly to make society more fair. And rarely does our community engage in that process. Rarely. So when we're talking about Fashion Nova, why don't we sit down and imagine what we think that company should be allowed to do as a company that's responsible to society, and what should they not be allowed to do? create a platform around that. Lobby our government to get them to change rules, or just go directly to the company and ask them to change. But we have to organize. We have to have a platform. We have to have goals, and we have to have explicit targets. I think that where we really get lost is in overestimating the power we have in the market. Our power is as citizens in the public sphere. We need to get organized. We just covered that. And to me, getting organized means to gain political power means you have a strategy, and you have goals, and you have a target. And we have to do that. There are already so many groups. So it's like you have the Sustainable Fashion Forum, like you guys could have a political or legal platform or do campaigns. I mean, obviously we do need education, right? That is an important part, but we do need more people who are getting together and saying, okay, what's the plan? And I just want to reiterate how inspiring the history of the consumer activist movement is, which is why I'm saying people should read the story. Do you mind if I just tell a couple of stories about them?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
So people don't often think of it this way, but a lot of the civil rights actions were consumer activism, like the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks, and the selective buying campaigns. Like basically what they did was leveraged Black buying power to desegregate public services, but also private businesses, get people elected. And it was like incredibly strategic. I'm talking about like master level strategy about how to get this stuff done. And then the two other examples I use in the story is one, the movement against the petrochemical industry that was kicked off by Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in the 1960s. And that movement of consumer activists led to the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency. Like consumer activists that helped introduce our first environmental regulations, but they also were effective in banning DDT and a couple other pesticides. So how would we do that as ethical consumers today? We would buy organic food. That's our solution. Whereas to those activists, that wouldn't have even crossed their mind, I don't think. Because that would mean you were permitting toxic chemicals to still be out in the world. Like they were always thinking about changing the rules of society so that everybody benefited. It would not have been enough to them for desegregation to only apply to some people who shop in some stores or whatever. You know what I mean? We have to think of what we're saying when we permit unequal and unjust things to happen in other parts of society that we're just not participating in because of where we shop.
Right. It's so deep. It's so deep. Like, wow. Yeah. And for everyone who hasn't read the article, you really, really should. I'm going to put it on our stories as well, and it'll be in Elizabeth, so you can check it out. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you learned a lot. I know that I definitely did. Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here, for sharing your time and your brain with us. And yeah, is there anything else? And maybe share where people can find you, where they can learn more about you and the work that you do.
On Instagram, you can follow me at Elizabeth L. Cline, and follow Remake and the Pay Up Fashion campaign. That's where I've been putting my, what I call public social change efforts. So we have this like platform to fight for regulatory reform and new contracts and living wages in the fashion industry.
Wait, does Pay Up Fashion have its own Instagram?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's not very active yet.
Okay. Well, I'll still have to follow it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And hopefully we'll talk soon.